My name's Kirsty Murray. I write for children and for young adults. I've published 19 books since 1998, and in 2006 I was an Asialink literature resident in South India at the University of Madras, which led to a continuing relationship with India. And in 2012 I was a member of the Bookwallah, travelling to India and spending 3.5 weeks with vast numbers of books in trunks and travelling with 3 Indian writers and the Australian writer Benjamin Law and our support team right across South India. Prior to 2006, I'd never been to India or even thought of going to India, but I began work on a project researching the lives of 29 Australian children who were members of a performing arts troupe called Pollard's Lilliputian Opera Company. And in order to tell their story, which involved a very controversial tour that they did in India in 1909-1910, I realised I was probably going to have to go to India. I'd never been there. I knew very little about Indian culture, but I applied for an Asialink literature residency at the University of Madras in South India and was really lucky to get it because it basically changed the way I write. It changed the way I thought about literature, and it changed my understanding of how stories travel and which stories transcend cultural barriers. And this particular novel was my 9th novel for young adults, but it was sort of became a turning point in how I approached my writing. And a lot of that was to do with meeting Indian writers, becoming exposed to the way Indian readers received Australian culture. It was a huge eye-opening experience. When I returned to Australia, it became the book eventually turned into a novel called India Dark, which was published by Allen and Unwin in Australia in 2010 and then published in the UK in 2012 and then in India in 2012 as well as The Lilliputians. Distribution of Australian literature into India is very much controlled by British and American publishers, meant that it changed the way I approached my own publishing career. And when I'd finished India Dark, my Indian publisher said to me, look, be really careful about who you sign with in the UK or your book will never make it into India. And this sort of conversation about distribution really tied to the Bookwallah, which happened in 2012. And the Bookwallah was an amazing project, and I was really proud to be a part of it because it was about breaking down those barriers that stop Australia having really articulate exchange with Indian writers and Indian publishers. So what the Bookwallah was this crazy idea initiated by Nick Lowe and Catriona Mitchell to take Australian writers to India and tour across India for 3.5 weeks with Indian writers, developing a conversation about literary exchange. So we travelled for 3,500 kilometres by train, slow travel, train, buses, cars, across South India, doing events and talking about Australian literature. And we travelled with 6 cases of Australian books that had been curated by myself, Benjamin Law and Michelle de Kretzer. And it was a huge privilege to talk not just about my own work, but about Australian books, writers, and the history of Australian literature, and introduce a lot of very fine writers to audiences in South India. The interesting outcome from Bookwallah, because everything you do in India always seems to have so many outcomes, everything seems to connect to something else. And for me, with Bookwallah, what happened on the tail end of it was when the tour had come to an end, hugely successful. We've got fantastic reception from audiences and from the press, and I decided to stay on in India for a little bit longer and go back up to Himachal Pradesh to do a residency up there. And on the way there I went through Delhi and met up with my Indian publisher Anita Roy, and we started talking about this exchange of stories between Australia and India, and all the things we have in common, all these things that I didn't know we had in common before I started working with Indian writers and publishers. And we came up with the idea to put together an anthology of speculative fiction titled Eat the Sky, Drink the Ocean. And that came out in India in November last year and in Australia in February 2015. And I think what that's done for me, having a number of books now coming out in India, it sort of gives you an ease in the culture when you're travelling there too. You know you have a place and you know you belong there. And what I like to think that Bookwallah achieved for Annie and Chandra House in particular, who've returned to Australia a couple of times, is that they have that sense of place here too. And ultimately that's what Asialink's about, really, is about having a sense of community right across Asia. Not that they're them and we are us, but that there's a mutuality of cultural exchange.